And we are back. We are live. Welcome everyone to session 2 of day 2 of the People's Summit. Hope many of you caught the amazing interview with Marie-Ève Marchand and Jean Lemire this morning. And let's pull up our Menti and see our word cloud of what our favorite activities in nature are. Okay, see hiking, huge, canoeing, birding, watching and listening, walking amongst trees, excellent. So many great things. All right, well, this session is focused on special areas for protection centered around the north shores of Lake Huron and Superior. And I'll be your moderator. My name is Katie Krelove. I am the Ontario campaigner for the Wilderness Committee. And we've got a jam-packed panel today in both quality and quantity. So I'm going to quickly introduce all of our panelists, and then to go and see their full amazing bios, you can go to the website. Okay, so on our panel today, we have Bob Barnett, who is with the Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy, Julee Boan, Boreal Program Manager for Ontario Nature, Anthony Merante, Director of Campaigns for Earthroots, Franco Mariotti with Save Wolf Lake, Douglas Boreham and Gabriella Zagorski, Douglas Boreham is with the North Shore Environmental Resource Advocates, and Gabriella is with Nature Reserves Campaigner for Ontario Nature. Naomi Grant with the Coalition for a Liveable Sudbury, and Cheryl Clavet, who is an owner of a camp in the Boreal Forest. And we also have John McDonald with us today, who is the Executive Director with CPAWS Ottawa, who will not be presenting, but who will be receiving your questions. So at any point during the presentations, you can add a question in our Q&A section. And at the end of all the presentations, John will be collecting them, and John and I will go through as many of your questions as we can. And just to let everyone know, we really do appreciate all of your questions, and we want to make sure they all get answered. So even if your questions don't get answered today in this session, they will be in a follow-up after the People's Summit. All right, so without further ado, we are going to start off with Bob Barnett and his presentation. So Bob, take it away.
Hi, it's great to be here. So our role is to look after the Niagara Escarpment, Manitoulin Island, the Huron shore, and of course the Saugeen watershed is in between. So next. So we do cliffs, we do shoreline, we do an internal lake like the one that's shown. And next. This is the Niagara Escarpment at Cup and Saucer up in Manitoulin. Next one. So over the last 100 years, about 130 years ago, Ontario started with Ontario Parks, but we should remember that they still represent only about 1.5% of Southern Ontario. 1946, Conservation Authorities, 1928, Ontario Nature, 1968, Nature Conservancy, and we got going in 1997. So we're 23 years old, but we're the new people in town. Next one. So nature reserves are great places to kind of look at what's happened before, and we protect these areas, and we get a chance to learn from nature if we can look after these places. Next. So we care because I have grandchildren. I want our grandchildren to see what I saw, and nature looks after us, flood control, places to visit, and the economic benefit in Southern Ontario of having nature there is $85 billion a year. That's almost the size of the Ontario budget. Next. Here's a little picture showing the species of conservation concern in this region of Ontario. And notice that they're gathered around the Great Lakes, and they diminish as you go north. Next one. So in Southern Ontario, the land trusts, as a group, there's 34 of us, I think, have protected about 100,000 acres. That's 400 square miles. And I just emphasize that the land trusts are conserving more land privately every year than all levels of government combined. Next one. And here are the protected areas. Green, you see big Algonquin Park there. You see the line of separating so-called North and South Ontario, the red line. At any rate, yellow are protected by regulation, which isn't all that strong. So the green ones are protected, but you'll see that Southern Ontario really isn't very well looked after. And there's some big splotches getting up north, but that's not protected to 25% either. Next one. So we're proud that we've got the Niagara Escarpment World Biosphere Reserve as our backbone. And it's just one of 600 reserves in 90 countries, one of only 13 in Canada. But it's very important for us that this extra recognition has been given to the escarpment. Next one. So I just give you one small example. One reserve, a lady I met her at the Leaside Rotary Corn Roast. We got talking. We got approvals from Environment Canada, closed in May 2017. That 100-acre reserve sequesters over 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide every year, and it protects just about $200,000 of ecological services. So we'll go quickly through the next three pictures just to give you an idea what that property looks like. Okay, so in 2019, we got 11 new reserves, took us to 180, over 1,000 new acres, worth $3 million, taking us to 22 million, and 3 new rare species, taking us to 59. So I don't know, I get pretty excited about all these statistics, but next one, here's a collage showing you what we achieved in 2019. Next picture. So in 2020, we achieved 10 new reserves, 726 new acres, that's 3 square kilometers. And primarily because of one reserve in the south, close to Toronto, that was worth $8.2 million. So crazy values. Some pictures of what we did in 2020. Next one. So the biodiversity agreement, I guess everybody knows that 193 countries jumped on board. We tried to get to 17%, didn't make it. But I emphasize Canada and Ontario are both around 10%, not 17%. Southern Ontario, however, was only a quarter of the goal at 4.5%. So here's the new goal, 25% by 2025 and 30% by 2030. So let's see how we make out. But E.O. Wilson, who is my guru, says we need to get to 50%. So even 30% would not be as much as the experts think we need. Next one. So what do? I get invited, like yesterday, I got invited to fight another development. Well, we don't do that very much because that's trauma medicine, very expensive, would drag us down trying to do that. So we don't do it very much. We don't try to change the regulations, almost impossible, but we do preventative medicine. So one at a time, we take properties out of the hands of developers, and we even take land out of the hands of nice people from the city who want to move to the country. So we're protecting shoreline, and there's lots of people that aren't happy with us because they think they have a right to live in the country. Next one. So we got started a little bit off the escarpment, even in 1999. 2001, we started working on the Huron shore. 1999, we got up to Manitoulin. Now we've got over 30 reserves up there. Then we got invited to Mattawa on the Ottawa River, nowhere near our area, but that landowner wanted help, so we helped them. Same thing happened in the Kawartha Lakes in 2019. So we sort of go where we're needed, but I prefer to stay within our region. Next one. So we're working very hard to get a trail going in Manitoulin. I cut my teeth with the Bruce Trail, and I know how important it is to have a trail so people can recognize it. But 26 of Manitoulин's 80 kilometers have been built by us of trail. I'd love to see a trail going across the whole island. And we give out 10,000 free hiking maps every year to get people off the ferry and onto a hiking trail. Next one. And hiking is our use of the land, nature reserves, very important. We've got, we think now it's up to 25,000 people a year coming to visit our cup and saucer trails. We had an economist illustrate that that brings $380,000 into the local economy. So we think it's better to have us than maybe hunting or houses or lumbering. So next one. So just some of our areas of interest: Huron shore, ancient cedars, glacial scours. Next one. Alvars for us are very important. This rare limestone pavement. We're just fighting a development next to one of our reserves right now where people want to cut down trees like this to build a cottage. Next one. And we've managed to get 18.5 kilometers of Lake Huron shoreline protected. So this for us is pretty exciting stuff. A lot of it's on Manitoulin, but Bruce Peninsula, and we go right down to Goderich. Next one. So we have, I have two people working with me, and Lieve and Shannon, and they write eco-sensitivity reports for Environment Canada. They help stewards. Most of our land is looked after by volunteer stewards. They write grant applications, and those volunteer stewards that are doing the bulk of the work. Next one. Yes, we have stewardship problems. Right now we have a woman suing us for $1 million because she tripped on a wire. She was walking off the trail, tripped on a wire, and she's got an ambulance chaser lawyer going after us for $1 million, but we have insurance. One landowner cut down 1,400 trees on a conservation agreement property, and he had to pay dearly for that. We have encroachments by cabins, patios. We have ATV traffic. We have the municipality just approved 2 new cottages in Anansi right beside our nature reserve. They don't seem to understand provincial regulation. And yes, who doesn't have Phragmites and buckthorn and garlic mustard? Serious problems, but we deal with it. Next one. There's our board. That's a few years ago. You can see that we're not exactly glamorous. That's a landowner that left us, that gave us a property, and here we are. That's our elegant board. Next one. So we've got 133 of our 192 reserves are actually owned by us. 90% of them are donated, and about once a year we actually buy a reserve. So 59 of the 192 are what I call conservation agreements, where the landowner voluntarily agrees to put restrictions in place. Next one. So conservation agreement, landowner says they don't want to see the land subdivided. They don't want gravel pits. They don't want new buildings. They tell us what they want. Next one. And sometimes other things. Next slide. So people get a tax receipt. Most beneficial at the time of generational transfer because you save capital gains tax. You get enough money to make sure that the next generation taking over the land doesn't get killed with taxes. Next one. So I just emphasize that a lot of people spend a lot of money on their gardens in the city. At $50 an acre, we're protecting another whole acre of land out in the country. And we've got 40 million trees to look after. Next one. And we do carbon offsets. We've got 40 million trees. They're giving us about $100,000 a year in revenue. We're very happy to talk to other organizations about how we do that. Next one. So far we've protected about 700,000 tons of CO2 and a few details, but love to talk to people about how we do that. We sell our additionality over and above what a normal woodlot produces that's harvested. 2021, good progress. We just got a new reserve, 161 acres, but the big one up north of Manitoulin on the Cloche is 2,140 acres, $1.7 million. we're just about ready to acquire another 500 acres worth $665,000. Next one, pictures of Heaven's Gate. Yeah, we've got 40 projects brewing, 5,000 new acres. So next one, you and your friends can help us build nature reserves. All this creates a natural legacy. Offset capital gains, offset your carbon use. You can have a green investment, work with us. So it's not something you have to be a land trust to do. Work with a land trust and you can achieve great things. Next one, we think our heritage matters very much, and one property at a time, we're doing something about it. Great, thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation, Bob, and for all the great work you do. And I'm super impressed with your presentation skills, getting through all those slides. All right, so we're moving on. Our next presentation is from Julee Boan, who is the Boreal Program Manager with Ontario Nature. So I'll take it away, Julee.
Thanks, Katie. I'd like to start by thanking Elder Marilyn Capriol for providing our opening prayer this morning and for helping us to have our conversations today in a good way. Chi-miigwech, Marilyn. And also thank you, Bob, for your presentation. That was incredible to see that much information covered in 10 minutes or so. So for my presentation this morning, I'm going to share some observations on how voluntary forestry certification, specifically Forest Stewardship Council or FSC certification, may provide us with some successes in terms of increasing the protected areas network in Ontario while providing economic benefits through responsibly managed forests. Next slide, please, Katie. So to start, I'd like to reinforce what some other speakers have been saying throughout the summit, because I think it deserves saying again. We know that climate change and biodiversity loss are two of the most significant problems facing us, and most of us acknowledge that we have a moral imperative to coexist with non-human living beings, and that we must leave a planet for future generations that is not only inhabitable, but allows for them to thrive. And as part of this global consciousness to achieve these goals, as has been discussed, and Bob went through these as well, I'm just going to repeat them again. In 2020, Canada committed to protecting 25% of its lands and waters in by 2025, and 30% by 2030. And these new targets reflect the urgent need to stem the accelerating loss of biodiversity worldwide. And while the government of Ontario announced in April this year its intentions to expand the province's protected areas system, it has been silent on any new collective targets. And as Bob said as well, I'm sure other speakers as well, we are at less than 11% of Ontario being protected. And this map just shows the percentage of each eco-district in Ontario that is protected. And as you can see, the vast majority have less than 10% protection today. Next slide, please, Katie. So how could FSC certification help the province to achieve these goals? FSC is a voluntary forestry certification system that provides companies that achieve its established standards with preferential market access. And you can find FSC labeling on the envelopes of our monthly bills, 2x4s, toilet papers, and all sorts of other products that are made from our forests. The FSC system is designed to follow a tree from the place it is harvested to where it ends up on the shelves of Staples and Home Depot and other places. Its purpose is to support responsible management of forests, including the protection of species at risk, Indigenous rights, workers' rights, and protected landscapes. About half of the forests managed for industrial logging in Ontario are certified under the FSC certification system. And a requirement of FSC certification that is relevant to our discussions is that forest managers must consult with Indigenous communities and interested and affected stakeholders to identify candidate protected areas on their forests. And they must work within their sphere of influence to support moving these sites to permanent protection. In Ontario, there are more than 1 million hectares of candidate protected areas identified through FSC certification that are sitting on the books. Next slide, please, Katie. So here's a map of FSC certified forests in Ontario and the candidate protected areas that have been identified to date. In addition to these forests, there are 2 more forests that are seeking FSC certification in Northwestern Ontario. So it's quite likely that even more candidate protected areas will be identified in the next few years. Next slide. As an ENGO, while we were excited about the opportunity these candidates represent, we wanted to make sure the sites had have high conservation values. If we are going to support that, they should be added to the province's provincial protected area system. So last year we conducted an assessment of all of these sites and published a report with our partner Birds Canada. In our assessment, we looked for the presence of species at risk and their habitats, cultural values such as pictographs or sites of historical significance, recreational values including canoe routes and portages, unique or declining ecosystems, calving habitat for species of local or regional interests, and adjacency or connectivity with the existing protected areas network. And the good news is that we found that the vast majority of these sites, about 85%, are of moderate to high conservation value, meaning only about 15% of these sites are ones that our organization would not want to support permanent protection for. And our co-authored report is available on our website with the link at the bottom of the slide here. Next slide, please, Katie. In the brief time I have this morning, I'm just going to share a few examples of sites that have been identified through the FSC system that we think could make strong candidates for permanent protection. So I've chosen 2 sites just west of Lake Nipigon, one near Hearst, and another close to Thunder Bay. Next slide, please. Many of the candidate protected areas identified through FSC certification are actually proposed additions to existing provincial parks and conservation reserves. The Ottertooth Creek site, which is about 6,500 hectares, borders the Obonga Ottertooth Provincial Park and the Ottertooth Conservation Reserve. This connected park system stretches about 100 kilometers along a system of lakes and rivers and is about 200 kilometers north of Thunder Bay. Along with its recreational value, there is an osprey nest there, and there's several moose aquatic feeding areas, and there are also active trap lines throughout the site. So given the range of users at this site, part of moving it forward to permanent protection will need to include strong engagement and a consultation process. Next slide, please, Katie. Bobalong Lake is another example of a candidate protected area that would result in an expansion of existing protected areas. Bobalong Lake is about 6,400 hectares, and there are moose aquatic feeding areas within the site, raptor's nests, and whippoorwill. Whippoorwill populations have been declining over the past 25 years or so, and they're designated as threatened in Ontario and Canada. The decline is most likely linked to habitat loss and significant changes in their prey base. Next slide, please, Katie. The Kingfisher Lake Candidate Protected Area is located about 20 kilometers from Thunder Bay and is adjacent to the Kingfisher Outdoor Education Center, which is operated by Lakehead Public Schools. This unique facility is loved by parents and kids alike, and it offers curriculum linked to experiential education and provides many year-round activities for kids and families. Protecting the forest around the center would provide additional space for outdoor learning. Next slide, please. And the last site I'll show you this morning is called Nagagamamis West. It borders part of a provincial park in northeastern Ontario, but it is particularly special due to its role it could play in supporting boreal caribou. This site overlaps with the Pegwachwan caribou range, and radio collaring has shown that caribou have been calving in this area. Boreal caribou are threatened, as most people know, in Ontario, and are particularly vulnerable to rogue networks that facilitate predator access in their ranges. Next slide, please. So we know that there are over 1 million hectares of candidate protected areas identified by forest managers and their staff on FSC certified forests, and that most of these areas have important conservation values. However, we don't know how much work has been done to date to seek the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous communities, or if local stakeholders support or have concerns about their protection. And a critical next step is to ensure there are strong, inclusive, and adequately resourced engagement processes. Since their protection is a public interest, we think that support for this engagement should come from governments. And in addition, at Ontario Nature, we work on many community and citizen science programs, and we've been given feedback from local naturalist groups that there is volunteer interest to go out to these sites and conduct various surveys on the ground to confirm some of their values through, for example, plant and wildlife surveys. Next slide, please. But most of all, we need the provincial government to be a willing partner in permanently protecting these areas. The Canada Protected Areas identified through FSC certification already have support from the forestry sector who identified them. And ENGOs like Ontario Nature and Birds Canada have assessed these sites and are supportive of most of them moving forward to permanent protection. But we need the province to take them to the next step through engagement and consultation, and then ideally regulated protection. Next slide. And just thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Julie, and highly recommend that report. Great work uncovering that 1 million hectares for potential protection. Next up, we have Anthony Mariotti and Franco Mariotti, who are going to be presenting on Wolf Lake.
Okay, thank you so much. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us to learn about Wolf Lake today. Special thanks to Sarah Winterton and the team at People Summit for bringing us all online. I think a lot of the themes that I'll cover today are going to dovetail really perfectly with Julie's presentation, mostly looking at a protected area that's been slated for protection for a while and just needing that next step to go forward. So my name is Anthony Merante. I'm the Director of Campaigns at Earthroots. We're an Ontario-based ENGO focused on protecting wilderness, wildlife, and watersheds. And today I'll be co-presenting with Franco Mariotti, a biologist and naturalist who will dive into the specifics of the special place and who has been leading a lot of the great work on saving the lake. So next slide. So let's start off by getting to know what Wolf Lake is. So in essence, it's a red pine reserve, and it is the largest known in the world. They only occur in North America, so it is North America's largest, but it's the world's largest at the same time. It's a beautiful snapshot of what the landscape used to look like pre-intensive resource extraction in the greater Sudbury area. And it's a haven for naturalists and biologists for portaging, research, and exploration. A key focus of this area is that it is sort of a control setting for the landscape of the greater Sudbury region as environmentalists push for renaturalization of the region. Next slide. And why protect Wolf Lake? Simply because it has a strong ecological significance. It is critical habitat for many species, many of which are returning as the area renaturalizes. And it is a player in the region's nature-based climate solutions effort, acting as a large carbon sink. And it has also been identified by the government as a place needing protection for years. Truly the only thing holding back Wolf Lake from moving forward as an officially protected area is its potential for mineral exploration. Next slide. So for those of us joining us from around Ontario, wondering where Sudbury is and where this beautiful old growth forest is, you'll find it just north of Lake Huron. So Katie, if you can just get one click. And then another click, you'll see that it is in the Wanapede Lake watershed. And then just another click over there. And on this area, you'll be able to spot Wolf Lake, mostly just trying to look for the lake shaped like a wolf howling itself. 2 more clicks, we'll be able to isolate it there. And just one more. Yeah, you can see that beautiful profile there. So aptly named Wolf Lake. So that's a bit of the high level for it. I'm just going to pass it on over to my co-presenter, Franco, and he'll go into a deep dive for you. So just go next
Thanks,
slide.
Andrew. Next, Katie. The old growth red pine forest at Wolf Lake has been there for centuries. If you wanted to know what Sudbury looked like before mining began, you look at Wolf Lake as an historical standard. For most of the last century, the area was severely hit by acid rain. Although it did not kill the trees, forest growth was severely curtailed. The lake became acid dead. The good news, though, is that in 2015, for the first time in almost a century, life has returned to the lake in the form of plankton, invertebrates, fish, and even turtles. Today, the forest and lake are a healthy ecosystem that is recovering from acid rain impacts. Next, please. As far back as 1999, the Ontario Living Legacy Program, for those of you who remember that move to protect lands, recognized Wolf Lake for its biological significance, a large, intact, old-growth red pine forest. As a result, the area was made into a forest reserve with the support of the local forestry companies. For those who fought for Wolf Lake's protection, we stood back and waited for the area to become a park. However, there was a history of mining exploration in and around Wolf Lake, which prevented further protection. In 2012, mining leases were to expire, and we expected the move to park status. Instead, the mining leases were renewed until 2033 without any public consultation. A new mining company bought out the previous and has renewed exploration in the area. Next, Katie. The historic range of the red pine stretched in a broad swath from the Maritimes and the New England states westward to Lake Superior. Today, only 1.2, that's 1.2% of that historical range of old growth red and white pine remain. On a map, they would look like pockets of old growth pines of varying sizes, from just a few hectares to over 1,000 hectares. Wolf Lake's old growth red pine forest is the largest remaining intact in all of North America. It covers 1,600 hectares. That's nearly 4,000 acres. Next, Katie. At Wolf Lake, the red pines are dominant as a tree species. They make up about 65% of the forest cover. Hence, we call it a red pine forest. At the height of the old growth forest controversy here in Ontario, back when people were being arrested in Temagami trying to protect the pines there, a report was commissioned by the MNR to review old growth in Ontario. It became known as the Isle Report. In it, the report identified Wolf Lake as an unusual area in that Wolf Lake's red pines, as they were aging, were being replaced by younger red pine. To most people, that would be logical. But what makes it unusual is that in most old growth pine forests, the white pine replaces red pine, but not at Wolf Lake, which is one of the features that makes the area ecologically unique. Next, Katie. Red pine trees are considered old growth from 140 years of age or older. They can live to 350 years, while white pine can attain 450 years. The oldest trees at Wolf Lake have a wide range of ages from just a few years to 300 years old. Size does not indicate age. Take this photo, for example. What you're looking at is one of the largest trees that I've come across in the area. It's a massive white pine, certainly by Sudbury standards. And by the way, that is the hand of the second person behind the tree. It's not the same person. The size of this tree is an exception, but not its age. Next, Katie. As you walk through the forest at Wolf Lake, you will notice red pine trees of all ages, from a few years old to trees of several hundred years of age. Many of these show fire scars. Click, please, Katie. The trees that demonstrate these scars are all living, some having survived 3 to 5 ground fires during their lifetime. Red pines live in a fire ecosystem and thrive. The proof is in the presence of all age classes of red pine. Next, please, Katie. For decades through the 1900s, in other words, most of the last century, Wolf Lake was an acid-dead lake. Due to sulfur emissions from the Sudbury smelting operations, the pH, in other words, the acidity of the lake, was so low that the lake had no life. It was acid-dead. But in 2015, life returned to the lake after years of sulfur emission reductions. The lake's pH has returned to a relative normal between 6 and 7, a perfect neutrality that allowed plankton, invertebrates, and eventually fish to come back. The last survey of the lake, taken in 2019, showed that all historical fish species have returned and were found in all age classes. Means they're replacing themselves as the fish get older and die. So where did they come from? There was no human intervention. The fish returned via natural water courses connected to Wolf Lake from the headwaters of Chiniguchi Lake to its north. Of course, all of this is good news. Now we need protection. Anthony? And next slide, Katie.
Thank you, Franco. And I'll just preface that bass was returned, totally fine, just used for the photo. So when we're looking at the region, you can see that Wolf Lake is surrounded by protected areas. We just click once. And ultimately, that is what we are seeking, an extension of these protected areas, and then in turn, a termination of these mining leases to assure the longevity of this old growth stand. Next slide. We see opportunities in helping achieve the living lands targets set out by the provincial governments in 2011, which are still unmet. We click once over here. So again, that is reiterating that less than 11% of Ontario is protected, and we can definitely help that with adding Wolf Lake to it. Next slide. And if the provincial government's working a little slowly, we can also look to achieve these opportunities with the federal government that are looking to achieve 30% protection by 2030. And personally, we think that Wolf Lake is an excellent contribution to Canada's goal of nature-based climate solutions with its resilience and its replacing. You can see that it is obviously a rebounding ecological system. Next slide. Because truly, it just makes sense to protect a region that is a snapshot in time of what our landscape once was, a landscape that'll help guide us in rebuilding lost forests and connect people and nature in a region that was once known for acid rain, moonscapes, and a lack of nature, which is now thriving, resilient, and rebuilding. We'll go with the next slide. So that brings us under time, which is good. You can follow us on any of our social handles over there if you feel like supporting a lot of these efforts. We are on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And I'll also plug savewolflake.org that Franco is a part of. And definitely there is a great, it's a short 17-minute film called Safe Wolf Lake on YouTube. Definitely a great watch.
Thank you. That was amazing. So evocative and informative. I swear I started to smell pine needles in my room here in Toronto. Thank you so much. Next up, we have Douglas Boreham and Gabriella Zagorski, who are going to be presenting on Blanding's Turtles of the North Shore. Take it away.
Thanks, Katie. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Yeah, like Katie said, my name's Doug Boreham. I'm a professor at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, and I'm joined with my colleague, Gabriella Zagorski, who now is with Ontario Nature, but at the time of this research we're going to talk about on Blanding's turtles, she was a graduate student at Laurentian University, co-supervised by me and Dr. Jackie Lipskis. Next slide, please. So the area we're going to talk about is on the north shore of Lake Huron, Georgian Bay area, and you can see on this map here that the area we're talking about is somewhere in the middle between Sault Ste. Marie to the west and Sudbury to the east. The area you see highlighted with the light blue and the red line around it is what we call the Serpent's Egg, or the Serpent River Watershed, as the First Nations would call it. This area has 3 First Nations communities surrounding it: Serpent River First Nations, Sagamok in Massey area, and Mississauga First Nations, which is just past Blind River. So this area we're talking about is of interest because you can see there's a little white arrow pointing to a small area just north of Algoma Mills, where a proposed quarry site is proposed to go in. And so this quarry site had to do some high-level environmental assessments. And in that process, it became apparent that there were some endangered species located in this area. And this area is a very small spot within the Serpent's Egg, which is part of the Robinson-Huron Treaty Lands. And so an organization called Turtle Island Center has been very interested in studying this whole entire watershed. I started doing research in this watershed some 30 years ago. You can see in the middle there, there's a place called Elliott Lake. Well, at the time I was growing up there were 10 uranium mines operating. And unfortunately, the uranium tailings contaminated a good portion of the Serpent River watershed. So our First Nation communities are fairly concerned about this watershed, and they want to protect it from many things, which leads to why do we want to protect this area? Well, because the proposed quarry has identified some endangered species, we initiated sort of a preliminary study. Next slide, please. So what was identified in the small area within the Serpent's Egg is these 5 species of Blanding's turtles, snapping turtles, painted turtles, whippoorwill, and mitosis bat, a little brown bat. They're identified as endangered, but the research that was done on them was very minimal, and just it was part of a process. As most of you know, it's very limited. On top of that, there's a number of other significant areas up there in the ecosystem, including connected wetlands and loose aquatic feeding areas, and et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. So in the beginning, it's kind of a story because I am not a turtle expert. I do a lot of research on radioactive contamination in ecosystems, fish, but most of my work is in laboratory work with cancer research. So I didn't know too much about turtles. And my story begins with, I didn't even know what a Blanding's turtle was. Next event. So I was at one of these student conferences that we have every year for all the graduate students, and they present their research. And an individual came up and did a presentation on snapping turtles. And I listened to the talk, and I'd been to an open house by the quarry company for this proposed site. And they had mentioned this terminology called Blanding's turtle, which I never even knew about. So I asked the student, did he know anything about Blanding's turtles? And in fact, he said he knows quite a bit, but the expert on Blanding's turtles is Dr. Jackie Liskis, sitting right up there. So I went and approached Jackie and said, hey, Jackie, I don't know anything about turtles, but I hear you're the expert. Would you be interested in studying these turtles? Because at the time, there were about 5 turtles identified in this area. She was very reluctant in the beginning. And because it was 2 hours away from Sudbury, and in fact, it was there was no real funding, and so she was kind of reluctant to do it. So then, serendipitously or luckily, a Blanding's turtle walked into Laurentian University about 3 days later, and it walked up the wheelchair ramp. And Jackie phoned me and said, "You got to come over here. I got a Blanding's turtle to show you." It walked into the university. So next slide. Next. So here's the turtle that Jackie was holding when I walked into her office. And she said, "This is an old Blanding's turtle, probably 70 years old." And she goes, "This is the sign." So she goes, "I will definitely do the turtle research with you." Next. So about 3 days later, I'm driving home from Sudbury, and lo and behold, there's a Blanding's turtle crossing the road near Sagamok Reserve. And I couldn't believe it. I'd never really seen one before. This is the very first turtle I found on the side of the road, and I helped him across the road. Clearly another sign that we had to do turtle research. Next slide. And the most important thing that happened was when we decided to recruit a graduate student, this person called Zagorski showed up in this outfit. And the first day I met her, she jumped into a swamp wearing this outfit and found a turtle. And I said, "Okay, this is a successful story. When you have someone that can, the turtle whisperer, or as we call her, next slide, Zagorski Blanderbolt. Y'all got to have a superhero in every story, right?" So because I'm not an expert in turtles, I just want to pass this over to Gabby, who is an expert, and she'll take you through some of the research she did and talk a bit about habitat, and then we'll close it off with some closing remarks. Gabby?
Next slide. So for those of you who haven't seen a Blanding's turtle before, they're a beautiful turtle with a bright yellow chin. It almost looks like they're smiling. They're a semi-aquatic turtle with a hinged plastron, which means they can almost close their shell all the way up to protect themselves from predators. And so Blanding's turtles are federally endangered and provincially threatened, and they can live in a variety of habitats, including marshes, bogs, fens, streams, and lakes. And it is important to note that the populations in Canada are clustered mostly along the Canadian Shield, but we do have some pockets in southern Ontario. Next slide. This is what Blanding's turtle habitat looks like around the Algoma Mills area. It's a mix of, again, marshes, bogs, fens, etc. So during Blanding's turtles' active seasons, they spend their time mostly in the water, and sometimes when it gets really hot, they'll come up a little bit on land to do things like estivating, which is sort of like hibernating, but it's done in the summer when the turtles have enough resources that they don't need to move around. But most of their time during the active season is spent in wetlands. Next slide. And so the interesting thing about turtles in the Algoma Mills area or along the Canadian Shield is that Although you can see them nesting along roads, if there were no roads in those areas, they would choose to nest on rocky outcrops. So these outcrops are really important for these turtles because in order to lay eggs and then continue on with future generations, they need to have these outcrops present. Next slide, please. And then in terms of overwintering, they will overwinter in little swamps, vernal pools, they'll overwinter again in wet habitat. And you can see a couple of photos on the screen here. So on the left side is actually two turtles. You can't really see them that well. You can maybe see a little bit of yellow under the ice there that I found in the spring, just almost completing their overwintering cycle there. And I did end up eventually breaking through the ice and pulling out those two turtles. And then the photo on the right side is another 3 turtles that were found right in the beginning of spring. Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly summarize what we found in our research, just because we don't have too much time. But again, the point of our research was to categorize these turtles' habitat. And in doing so, we had to capture them and place radio tags on them that allowed us to track them using specialized equipment. And so while doing this, we were hoping to find, somewhere between 5 and 20 turtles, and we ended up stumbling upon at least 56 of them. And so this was way more than we had ever expected to find in this area, especially in the northern range limit for these species. We actually had a density that was one of the highest densities reported in Ontario for Blanding's turtles. And when we ended up categorizing the habitat and putting the quarry boundary over top, we ended up having around a 66 to 100% cover for Blanding's turtle habitat in that area. So this site is very significant for Blanding's turtles and has a very healthy population. Next slide. And so we did end up publishing this research, and if you do want to look further into it, you can absolutely access this article. It is open access. And if you don't know where to find it, please feel free to send us an email and we can definitely send it to you, but just to get a little bit more information on the research. Next slide.
So I'll take over from here. So just to rewind a little bit, the reason for doing this research in the beginning was because of what we call a BACI study, a before-after control impact study. And that simply means characterize the population in an area. Then if there's going to be some interventions by man-made activity like mining or quarrying, you can implement some mitigation strategies to protect the population that you've identified. And after the operation begins, you monitor the population and then determine whether or not your mitigation strategies are successful, so that in future generations, when we do things like mining and stuff, we can protect using the proper techniques. So the BACI study kind of did not pan out in the end for a number of reasons, which we don't need to get into. But the bottom line is we discovered this very dense population of Blanding's turtle in this area of the Serpent's Egg, which is why we believe that it needs to be protected from a scientific perspective. However, there are concerned citizens in the area that have formed several organizations. One of the organizations seen in the slide is called the North Shore Environmental Resource Advocates. And they're very interested in protecting this area and making it a conservation area. So I have a short video that they made from a concerned community perspective. And I'll just go to the next slide before we start the video. And we want to thank you for listening to this presentation. And we hope you enjoy this video, and obviously we'll answer questions later.
When I first came to this lake, I met my husband, and I fell in love with the area. No matter what part of the lake you visit, there's beauty all around you. It is so tranquil and restorative. My name is Elizabeth Roussel, and I'm treasurer for the North Shore Environmental Resource Advocates Incorporated. We are a group of people who are trying to prevent a quarry from being built in the northeastern corner near Lake Lozon. They're proposing to put a quarry in and extract aggregate. Our council just recently changed a zoning bylaw from restricted open space to mining extraction. Our group is appealing this decision so that we can maintain the area and protect the environment. We are using the funds from this GoFundMe account to hire a lawyer to help us through the appeal process in order to have the council's decision reversed. Throughout this whole process, there have been many ups and downs, and the people who have reached out, either monetarily or through their words, help spur us on so that we can continue this fight. Because there are days where you really feel down about what, that we're never going to accomplish much with this, but with the encouragement of others and their words, it's very helpful.
Thank you everyone
So
for
much,
listening.
Doug and Gabby, and I do have to, full disclosure, I have a real soft spot for these Blandings turtles, as I have visited the area with Doug and others, and got to hold a turtle that was found. So thanks so much. And we'll move on to our next speaker is Naomi Grant, and Naomi is the co-chair of the Coalition for a Liveable Sudbury.
Thank you, Katie. Yes, we're coming back to Sudbury now on Tikmashing Anishinaabeg territory in Northern Ontario. We heard Franco speak about Wolf Lake, which is irreplaceable globally and needs so much to be protected. And I'll be talking about the Laurentian University Green Space, which is irreplaceable locally and also very much needs to be protected. Next slide, please. This green space is really essential for the wellness of our community, for our people, for the ecosystem, watersheds, our lakes, and our drinking water. Next slide, please. It's over 200 hectares of green space. The yellow area on this map, adjacent to the Lake Laurentian Conservation Area, another green space, really the largest urban natural area within Greater Sudbury, and the only remaining natural areas within the Ramsey Lake and Nipawin Lake subwatersheds. There's ski trails maintained by the community, hiking trails, beaches for swimming, 5 lakes, creeks, and wetlands. So, and wildlife habitat, including Blandings turtles and whippoorwills in this area. So it's a really important green space that has its own intrinsic value, but is also so central to the community. We've been looking at wilderness spaces, but natural spaces within urban areas are so important for people to be able to connect to nature and to protect the natural values within our cities and communities. Next slide, please. This is a keystone green space in Greater Sudbury, and we have a really special relationship to green spaces in our community. One reason is because it's part of the way we live here. So all year round, people love to be outside and connecting with nature, whether they're skiing or skating or snowshoeing or swimming, bird watching, fishing, collecting blueberries. And having this green space makes that possible for many people in our community who could not otherwise access nature. Next slide, please. We also have a really special relationship and value for our green spaces because we were not always green. Sudbury was an industrial wasteland for a long time, and our landscape has been transformed to green through community regreening efforts. And this green space, the Laurentian green space, is an example of regreening. It's also where a lot of the science of how to do regreening was developed. And it has been cared for by the community. It really embodies that transformation of the landscape that we have done together for a healthier community for all of us. Next slide, please. This green space always has been by the community for the community. So from the ski trails that started out by student efforts and are now cared for and maintained by the community, to the hiking trails that were first mulched by community members of all ages with wood chips, to lights and memorial benches that have been put up in memory of loved ones, to the maintenance of trails and signage and community events. It's a labor of love by the community, for the community. Next slide, please. It's also an outdoor classroom and laboratory for students of all ages. So students from a number of programs from Laurentian University, but also students from area high schools and elementary students, whether they're like meeting a turtle for the first time or learning about ecology or training or competing in athletics. It's really an integral part of our education system here as well. Next slide, please. And for residents all through the community, it's so important to health and wellness, both physical and mental. It's where people can connect to nature and be active. It's always really well used, but this past year in the pandemic, there just are even more people on the trails. It's so essential for our health. And it's accessible to everyone. So unlike most of the larger trail systems, you can get there easily by bus or by bike. I myself don't have a car, so this is awesome that I can hop on the bus with my skis, go skiing in the winter. This is the place you go to daily to connect to nature. It's also the first place you take someone who's visiting Sudbury. Or if you're recruiting doctors to come live here, again, this is the place you take them and they decide this is a great place to live. Next slide, please. So we'll just go back to look at the map for a moment. There's two vulnerable subwatersheds touched on by this green space, Nipawin Lake and Ramsey Lake subwatershed. The watersheds here are small and they have thin soils with a lot of bare rock. So they're quite vulnerable. And as you can see, these are urban watersheds, very urbanized, and the health really does rely on keeping this area natural. Ramsey Lake is our drinking water source for 40,000 residents. It's also really enjoyed by residents for swimming, just walking, fishing, boating. Nipawin Lake as well has beaches, home to the Island Swim, a great local event. So both of these lakes are really valuable to the community and also very vulnerable. They have very high phosphorus levels, high salt levels, blue-green algae blooms. They really rely on this remaining natural area in the watershed for their health. Bethel Lake, another very urbanized small lake with high phosphorus levels and other contaminants that could overflow into Ramsey Lake if this green space is not preventing flooding events. Lake Laurentian and Bennett Lake, on the other hand, are not developed, which is very special for urban lakes. And Bennett Lake in particular is quite a remarkable ecosystem, lots of great swamp plants and animals, including species at risk. And this area is also the principal wildlife corridor within the Ramsey Lake subwatershed. So just really important ecological area. Next slide, please. So this land and water has its own integral value, but it's also very valuable to us because it's protecting our access to nature, it's protecting wildlife habitat, watershed health, lake health, drinking water, and so important for climate mitigation and adaptation as well. And here in Sudbury, it's also protecting us from industrial impacts. So although this landscape is regreened, within the soil and the silts, there's a lot of heavy metals bound up there waiting. And if this area is devegetated, that will wash into our lakes and cause another pulse of industrial contamination. So it's really protective to us. I also want to note that all of the studies and policies that are currently protecting us are all based on the assumption that this land remains natural. So our subwatershed studies, our community energy and emissions plan, our source water protection plan, all of the modeling that's done for water quality and quantity and carbon sequestration is all assuming that this area will remain natural. Next slide, please. So this is obviously a central part of our community, a heart of our community, a keystone green space. Why are we worried about it now? Well, on February 1st of this year, Laurentian University declared insolvency and is currently undergoing the CCAA process. They're soon to be undertaking a real estate review to decide which of its property it will sell to pay its creditors. This green space is Laurentian University property, and there's a lot of concern in the community that this green space could be sold for the benefit of creditors, the major creditors being the large banks in this case, and lost to the community. Really, this is unthinkable. This is unthinkable to our community to lose this space. But we also know that through the CCAA process, many unthinkable things have already happened. A third of the faculty have been fired summarily. The only bilingual midwifery program in Canada was cut. The second oldest Indigenous studies program in Canada was dismantled. This process is looking at paying back creditors and financial considerations. It's not looking at community considerations. So as a community, we're coming together to say this land is not for sale. This land has to stay natural. This land has to stay a green space that's accessible to the community. And so we're doing our best to do that through the efforts. We know that if a sale happens, it could happen quickly. And so we are rallying together and doing our best to prevent that. And we welcome everyone who would like to help with our efforts to connect with us as we move forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Naomi. Those stories of near urban, accessible nature is so important, and really disturbing news that it could be sold. So hopefully people will go and find out more and help out with that project to save it. Our next presenter is Cheryl Clavet, and Cheryl's going to be talking to us about coexisting with threatened caribou from a fly-in lodge owner's perspective. So take it away, Cheryl.
Thank you. In my life, I never thought I'd be participating in anything quite like this. I spent 30 years in surgery as a nurse and met my husband because I was on a canoe trip through this lake system, which is about 80 air miles north of Nakina, Ontario, and part of the Boreal forest. It's a Kenogami forest area, which is 4 million hectares. And we are a small piece of the pie that the industry, the logging industry, is licking their lips over, as I would say. I never thought I'd be fighting for the soul of our own existence as a business, as well as one of our coexisting partners, which is the woodland caribou. It was told to us when we first got this business in 2004 that Kimberly Clark, who was cutting the Kenogami at the time, which has been cut for 71 years, that they would leave a buffer zone around our lake system of 1 kilometer because of this protected caribou that live there, as well as there's 3 other lodges on the system, which is the only unique system in the Kenogami forest with 3 functional lodges on 3 different lakes that are all joined. And the caribou calve and swim down the lake, and they use, as you can see in the slide, they walk up onto these islands and they bed in the deep moss, and they also eat a lot of the lichen in the areas. And this is a beautiful glacier area. It's deposits. One of the things that we have here is a special rock called an omerluk from the Belcher Islands, which is an igneous basalt rock, and it's carried down by the glaciers 5.9 million years ago, and they make these incredible holes in all these stones that you find here. This is my dog Filson, who loves where the caribou used to bed. So when the caribou are finished calving and they bed down on the islands along Mita, and they leave and they go to the shores around us into that 1 kilometer buffer. Filson likes to sniff out the moss and have a good snooze. So I never thought I'd be fighting for this area, but in this year we received a letter from the MNRF as well as from NEDAC, who's the logging company that acquired these areas, this Kenogami forest, that they are going to be cutting 200 meters from the shoreline, circumventing Era Lake, Mita Lake, and up by Abmasagi, which is our north end of Mita. They already cut over alarmingly close to the watershed through this area in the north end of Mita, and you can hear some of the logging trucks using the Agoki Road. So that 1 kilometer buffer was so important for noise factor because we are this little microsystem on this lake with old growth poplar and spruce that is very close to the Arrowland Mill, which is an indigenous area, and they have a mill which apparently is owned by Buchanan. So we named one of the islands Caribou Island because it's habitually visited by the females who bring their calves there to protect them from our very large timber wolf population that surrounds us here. And Caribou Island is noted because biologists have gone there, as well as many guests like it there because it's so far away from everything. It's 12 miles from our main lodge. Next slide. And you can go there, and this is Caribou Island. And as you can see in the front, there's a little bit of protection from the forest in the area. And the caribou on the other side, and they bed down and nobody bothers them. We've learned to live with them. They've learned to live around us because we don't have a large population of guests that come through here because it's so hard to reach. Next slide. So as you can see around us, across on the very top part of the slide, that's the Ogoki Forest Reserve. They're going to be cutting that. And on this part, the lower part of the slide would be the Kenogami Forest Reserve. And so we are trying to protect this area because of these caribou, but also it's our life source. So what I've noted from being in a battle since October with NEDAC and the MNRF and learning about Bill 229 and government deregulating and removing red tape for logging companies, this is all news to us. We never thought we would be in this situation trying to keep our businesses afloat, threatened by bigger business. But also, since when do logging companies railroad a protected species? I thought with forest conservation certification that this was something that the caribou would always have this protection, this elusive little canary in the mine shaft. You know, it peeks out on these islands all the time, and people come up here because this is part of their bucket list. To see one of these little woodland caribou, even the biologists say they're so hard to see. Yet when you're drifting in some of the many tributaries that come in and out of this area, which would be good, by the way, for the turtles, you see them and they peek out. So I think what's happening here in Canada, if not in all of Northern Ontario, is that we're losing what is Canadian. And this is our lake system. And on the south end of Era Lake, they're saying that they're going to cut 200 meters after the calving is done. So I'm no scientist, but I could tell you that if I was a caribou and I like things nice and quiet and I needed large timber to protect me from the wolves, and I can't, you know, jump over a slash pile, I'm not going to be returning to that south end of NSERA where we, you know, where they calf. And it doesn't take a scientist to tell you that. But the way that people have talked to me when I've been inquiring is that I'm some sort of stupid little Canadian that says, you know, you don't understand, we have to log this. Well, I'm asking, why do we have to log everything? Why can't we preserve some of these spaces that are so precious to us and so precious to tourism in Canada? We get global people that come here because they don't want to hear anything. This is their reset button. And so when the calves are born, they bring them all the way down Eyre Lake, and you see them swimming through the channels, and then they keep their calves on the slew of islands that are along Meadow Lake. And as you're drifting between the islands, you'll see a few of them peek their heads, but you'll see some of these beautiful caribou in there that are just drifting in the waters. And, you know, when you have fly-ins like this, you don't have a lot of pressure on the lake systems. And with this 1 kilometer buffer around this area, these caribou have enjoyed being able to thrive. And even with the logging that is now down towards Brace Lake and so on, we're starting to hear noises and we're starting to see less and less caribou activity. So this is what we're trying to get. We negotiated with the MNRF and NEDAC, and they've given us a 500, as you can see in some of our, when we're building a calendar, the caribou are part of our life up here. They're what you see when you come here. But as we were negotiating with these companies, we realized that they do not care about this group of caribou. They care about a clear cut, which brings in more moose hunting, and they care about big timber. And this is where our lodge is situated in this bay, and the caribou exit through the south end of Mita, and we're across from this little island, and we're nestled in here, and it's very quiet, and it's not uncommon to see a caribou swim by in the morning mist before the planes get here. On Saturdays at 4 a.m. on first light, there's one of our big boys. He's just beautiful, and you'll see him in the channel, and he just peeks out every now and then, you know? So he's our bucket list for many of the tourists that come in, and they say, I'm looking for him. And if you're so lucky and so blessed, he'll peek his head out of the swamp, etc. But this is where they live. And by losing what is Canadian, I think we're literally bleeding out our boreal forests, the last of our old growth timbers. Countless spawning streams are in here. And then we have this threatened species. And so now I'm finding out that failed policies and practices are what is causing so much environmental damage. And I listen to all of you, and I have such deep respect for what you're doing, because what's all wild and pristine and beautiful is collapsing at an alarming rate. And when they talk about years of excessive clear cutting, it's just a blah, blah, blah. Bad planning, failed regulations, weak compliance. We hear it all the time, and you become deafened, but you don't realize what it's doing. You know, this is such a small piece of pie. They don't need to cut this 1 kilometer buffer around us at all, even if they gave us 500 meters. Why do they need it all when we have this species here to protect? And then 3 businesses that bring in millions of dollars to communities around us annually. And it's a poor business plan to go into an area, deforest it, take everything, and then tell me that you get to use that logging area in another 70 years, if the trees grow. And with the amount of temperature increases that we're witnessing and experiencing in this area, who's to say that these trees will ever grow back? I think it's a poor business plan. Ours is an annual income for everybody around us. This is just whack down the trees, leave the slash piles, destroy a species, and then move on. And this is the problem with what's happening. They're talking about changing regulations to preserve areas like this. Well, it can't happen fast enough, because once these trees are gone, they're gone. And once those trees are gone, this species is failing. There's no way on God's green planet, you know, in the shadows of the caribou mosaic, things they tell us they're going to move the caribou. Caribou don't move like this. This is a stationary herd. They hear a plane, they stop eating. They hear roads, they move away, they stop breeding. They do not calf every year. I've had to research caribou, research regulations. I never thought I'd be doing this. I thought we lived in an area that was being preserved, but you have a protected species with no protected lands for the past 20 years. I am shocked, dismayed, disappointed with the government. We're stewards.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. It's I think we all feel your passion and your tears, and you offer such a unique and on the ground perspective. It's amazing. And I want to thank all of our panelists. I mean, it's been such a spectrum of perspectives, really, and I also want to thank them all for doing such a great job of staying in their time limit, which means that that we do have time for some questions. And I know I've got some, but John, I think I'll turn it over to you as our receiver. Do you want to start us off with our first question?
Yeah, so I've got a couple of questions. The first one is a quick question for Julee. In your presentation, at one point you used the expression that some areas were sitting on the books, and we have a question as to what does that mean when something is sitting on the books?
Sure,
I'll just remind our panelists to unmute.
Sorry, go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to remind our panelists to remember to unmute, but I didn't.
So in the case of the FSC sites, they're only even quasi on the books in the sense that they've been identified by FSC certified companies. They've been presented to FSC auditors. But from what I understand, they aren't even identified in the forest management plan, because the province, based on the forest management planning manual, doesn't allow for that to take place. So they're only even partially on the books, and in the sense that they don't have it's a voluntary set aside. So it's fantastic that some forestry leaders are willing to set these areas aside, but there's nothing to limit mining development or extraction. There's nothing to limit hydro development. There's nothing to limit or exclude aggregate development. So they don't have any real legal protection associated with them. So that's what I meant by on the books. There's maps of them that are out there, but other than the forestry company's voluntary set-asides, they don't have much more meaning than that.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Julie. And I just want to throw in that it seems like that's sort of a theme of several of our presentations, is this gap between sort of identified candidate protected areas or potential or should be protected areas, and then that leap to actual legal protection. So I have got a question for Bob. It says, congratulations, Bob. For someone who is just starting to consider a land trust, what is the most important advice you would give, and what's the biggest mistake to avoid?
So that's a tough one. Sorry, what was the first part of it again?
What is, for someone just starting to consider a land trust, what's the most important advice you would give and the biggest mistake to avoid?
Okay, so I think when we got started, it was a pretty simple organization, just a couple of us doing all the volunteer work. And then once we got going, we realized that it actually takes quite a lot of infrastructure. And so there's a lot of administrative work behind running a land trust. So I would encourage looking at the options in your community, like teaming up with an existing land trust so that organizational work is diminished by letting them do it or teaming up and helping them. And I don't know that the biggest problem, we just, I don't know, I kind of see myself fighting alligators every day. The problem is you can just never get everything done. And trying to get volunteers organized and coordinated is one of the biggest parts to get everything fitting together and working regularly. So it's not that easy running a land trust. I mean, we've got 192 nature reserves, and we're doing it with 3.5 full-time staff. So, because I like to see the money spent on protecting nature. We can protect a reserve for, say, $5,000 because the land's donated. But trying to raise the money is the biggest problem. It's not a mistake, but we just went out and raised $1.7 million. Well, that was kind of a miracle, and it took a lot of volunteer and a lot of effort, let me tell you.
Thanks so much, Bob. Yeah, it makes us all appreciate your dedication a lot. And John, I'm going to go for our next question just because it's coming from one of our head honcho organizers, and Janet. So Cheryl, Janet's wondering, how can the public help expose this bad business plan that you're talking about?
Start reading. I didn't know anything about how this whole forest management planning comes together and what these FSC certifications were about, Julie. So it was just basically uneducated. There's local committees that the ministry is now in opening up to public, because many of these decisions were made without ever talking to the public or letting us know locally. And I was born and raised in this community. And so coming back after 30 years and being a lodge owner really wasn't in what I had foreseen. But for Mita and Era Lake and Brace, we became a consortium in order to fight for our right to maintain a reasonable distance away from the lakeshore surrounding our fly-in lodges. At one point, we were told by one of our negotiators that perhaps we should change our business model to a drive-in. Shocking to me, since we have built our business through blood, sweat, and tears and tremendous amount of commitment, both physical and financial, to embracing this area and making it what it has become, and practicing conservation with our fishery and with all of our guests that arrive here. I give them a printout on caribou studies, and you know, when you see a caribou, we have a beautiful moose and wolf and bear population up here. The eagles have made a comeback. It's like crazy, you know, and butterflies we've never seen before have moved in. So it takes communicating with our local business partners, which you know, years ago we were more competitive, you know, with our lodges around the lake, and now we realize just how important one another are. So you have to read what arrives in the mail, and unfortunately during the pandemic we never were getting planes in all of last year, so we got a lot of these notifications late about the cut. But in 2014, when NEDAC was awarded the Kenogami contract, we were never told that we suddenly didn't have a 1 kilometer buffer anymore and that nobody was going to protect the caribou. We were never told this. And then when I called the biologist at the MNR last year, he pretty much laughed me off the screen and said, well, there's no protection. They're protected species, but there's no land protection. And I'm sorry, but the MNR's changed in the last, you know, 10 years. It's not like it was. Well, then I contacted older MNR people who I grew up with. I brought their kids canoeing and they said, yeah, it's not the same. Well, what is Canada if not our wild spaces? What is Canada without the wildlife, without the places that people dream of? What is Canada without the tourism? How do we make people aware of what the Boreal produces? You know, when you log it and you strip it and the carbon that's released, there's so much reading to do, and it's forums like this. I didn't know about all of you people, and I am so grateful to be part of this now. I'm so grateful for contacting Wildlands League, who it really ticked a lot of people off that I would poke my nose in such a thing, but I didn't know where to go to find out who's going to help me protect this species. If the ministry won't, if my government won't, who will? If they cut all the red tape for endangered species, where do we go with all of this as a people? You know, and so as businesses, we need to work together and be aware of what's happening behind the scenes. And deforestation and deregulation is not our friend. We need to work with everybody in order to give ourselves buffers so that we have clear drinking water and places to go.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Yeah, and I think that's what this conference and this People's Summit is all about, is connecting all of these stories. We are at the end of our session. We might have time for one more question though. Tech team. John, do you have one more quick question for any of our panelists?
Yeah, I have a quick question for Anthony and Franco. So the question they ask: have you been in touch with Minister Wilkinson with respect to the Wolf Lake issue, and do you expect any action on his part, or is he able to help you in any way?
The coalition has written to politicians, but we have been not directly in touch with this minister. We've tried to have face-to-face conversations with MNDM and MNRF, by the way. Both have turned us down. They didn't even want to meet with us. It's unbelievable in this democratic society. So they only want us to use through the website where you submit your comments, and that's all they'll listen to right now. I memean, let's face it, we know this provincial government is not very environmentally friendly, and that's what we're facing. We're a real roadblock in many ways. If it affects development, we haven't had much success. So our main efforts have been concentrating on educating the public how special, like all of us, our places are. That's what we got to keep on pushing. We may hopefully open up people's eyes to how precious these natural assets, and that's what they are, their natural assets are. And that's the battle we've been fighting. We've created this film that Anthony referred to earlier, and video can be a powerful medium, as some of you know, so I encourage you to use that method also. So we will continue and we will push to talk directly to politicians, but at this point in time, it's been very difficult.
And I can just say from Earthroots' point of view, so I'm just a recent addition to the team at Earthroots, but I think it's very lucky that they have a, you've ever seen their past campaigns, quite pointed point of view, and not really shying away from calling out poor policy. Cheryl, exactly what you're saying is a beautiful way of putting it, that there are gaps, our governments are kind of failing us, they are failing us in this, and there's poor protection, a lot of gaps. So I can say from our point of view and joining that team, the minister will definitely be hearing from us, and yeah, I can be a very persistent person. And yeah, if they're not willing to take meetings in person, we'll make sure that the public is aware that they're not willing to, and that this is a place that needs to be saved.
Could I just say that there is funding available? If Naomi and Frank and Anthony talk to us, we may be able to help you with that aspect of it.
Great.
We will.
And, just to our speakers, we do have to wrap up, but I'll just ask for those speakers who haven't had a chance to answer questions, Doug and Gabby or Naomi, is there anything that you want to add to sort of what the theme of these questions have been? Last words?
I'll just add that I think one common theme is that the existing policies and protections that are in place are often not what people think they are and not what people actually value. So I really encourage everyone, just make it a habit to talk to your representatives, your MPs and your MPPs, and tell them what's important to you and that you want the legislation and protectives to reflect that, and not to be overriding business interests over the health of communities and the health of our lands and our water.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have one quick comment, and I agree with Naomi. It's very difficult for us to understand that the regulations and the regulators are sort of have a difficult time right now. And I think it's important that you know, one of the pictures we showed was our MPP holding the turtles in that video, and he's really helpful, but unfortunately he's got a lot of not in the quite right party. He's not in the right party right now to make decisions. So it is very just unfortunate.
Yeah, and I would also agree with what Naomi said. We just need to really encourage people to look into the legislation when there's proposed changes, and if they don't agree with it, speak out, again, on Twitter, on any social media, or again by calling your local MP.
Okay, well, I think that's a great place to leave it, with a call to action for people. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. This has been so informative, so much packed into. Thank you to our elder, Marilyn Capriel, for sitting in with us too. Marilyn, did you have something quick to add, real quick, 1 minute?
I certainly do. I'm so impressed with all of you. You've moved me so greatly. These are things that I hear over and over and over again. Well, I've got lots of white hair. I love you too. You know, I didn't get it overnight. I got it through a dream, and you are my dream. You just keep advocating, you keep your prayers, you keep focused as to what it is. We talk about Aboriginal rights and this kind of rights, but I want you to know the animals have rights, the trees have rights too. They are living things. Let's not take that life away from them. Just keep up your good work. You're very special. Miigwech.
Thank you for those words. And we are going to be signing off. Hopefully many of you will stay for our next session, which will be starting at 12 and go till 2 p.m. and we'll focus on cities and the Greater Golden Horseshoe in particular. So thanks again to our panelists, and have a miigwech to you, Marilyn.